If you've been even vaguely interested in PC gaming in the last, 20 years or so, then you're probably aware of Steam and by extension, Valve. But who's behind Valve? Where did they come from? Surely they didn't just ascend to the top of the PC gaming mountain overnight? Valve was formed in 1996 by two former Microsoft employees. Gabe Newell, a former Harvard student who dropped out to go work for the software giant, famously heading up the team that ported Doom from MS-DOS to Windows 95. And Mike Harrington, who had previously worked as a game developer for Dynamics and later on Windows NT with Microsoft. The two taking inspiration from Michael Abrash, another former employee who left Microsoft in order to join id Software to work on Quake a few years prior. Newly formed, Valve set to work on what would become their first game, and that game was Half-Life. Half-Life, for those that don't know, is the best first-person shooter of all time. Okay, that might be a little hyperbolic, but at the time it was a slightly more realistic statement. Produced by around 30 people on a heavily modified version of the Quake engine that they had licensed from id Software, Half-Life was a pivotal moment in gaming, especially in the first-person shooter space. Up to this point, the genre had largely been relatively light on narrative elements, technology at the time not being sufficiently advanced enough yet to present the types of in-engine story moments that we see today. FMV was used in a lot of cases, but CG at the time was less than amazing. Prior games that set the bar in the genre like Quake, Duke Nukem 3D and Blood largely focused on the combat and little else. There was usually some kind of narrative tying everything together, but you often had to go looking for it in the manual or read text scrolls on loading screens in between levels to find it. Half-Life broke from the norm by retaining play control throughout, with all bar one scene giving the player freedom to dick about as they wished during the scripted sequences.
This is a rare opportunity for us. This is the purest sample we've seen yet.
And potentially the most unstable.
This, it was thought, would create an immersive world rather than a shooting gallery, according to Gabe Newell. Mark Laidlaw, a sci-fi novelist, was hired to craft the game's narrative and story, and remained at Valve until 2016. I won't be going into massive amounts of depth about Half-Life, because honestly, this section would end up being about 3 hours long. But let it be known that Half-Life is good. Really good, in fact. It still holds up perfectly today. Releasing in 1998, it received near universal praise, with high 9s and 10s from critics and gamers alike, and the original PC release still sits at a 96 out of 100 on Metacritic, with a user score of 91 out of 100. Two expansions were developed and released by Gearbox Software, the first being the excellent Half-Life Opposing Force in 1999, taking place from the perspective of one of the soldiers sent into the facility, and Half-Life Blue Shift, a year later in 2000, a far shorter and much less fondly remembered instalment, with the player taking the role of one of the game's security guards, Barney Calhoun. It generated an enormous modding community, the relative ease of use and flexibility of the engine, as well as a full suite of tools included in the box, making it an incredibly accessible platform for enthusiasts to work on. The developers behind the Quake mod, Team Fortress, were hired to remake the mod as a game for Half-Life in the form of Team Fortress Classic. Fan projects such as Counter-Strike and Dave Defeat being so successful that their developers were hired by Valve and their games made official products, with both going on to be successful series in their own right. Half-Life rocketed Valve into the PC gaming spotlight, a feat all the more impressive due to it being their first release as a studio. As the 90s rolled into the 2000s, work began on the follow-up to Half-Life, unoriginally named Half-Life 2. The team working on the game grew from around 30 people to upwards of 100. The engine was completely redeveloped in-house and named the Source Engine. It added facial animation, a comprehensive physics engine in the form of Havoc, and once again came with a full suite of development tools for modders to take advantage of from right out of the box. It released to overwhelming praise in 2004, garnering similar scores to the original and earning 39 Game of the Year awards. Something was different this time though. Half-Life 2 released physically on DVD as you would expect, but also launched on a new online distribution platform developed by Valve called Steam. A name that at this point is synonymous with PC gaming, but at the time there was nothing like it. And nothing on it either. Steam launched with only Valve's games on the platform, Half-Life 2, Counter-Strike Source and Dave Defeat Source, as well as its back catalogue of original Half-Life and its mods and add-ons. It remained a closed platform for a year or so, until Ragdoll Kung Fu and Darwinia were released in 2005. It's tempting to say that this was the point wherein the floodgates opened, but in reality it wasn't. By the end of the following year, 2006, around 100 games had hit Valve's platform. Demos and videos became available as it started to transform into something a little closer to what we see today. By 2010 that number had grown to 1,000 games, increasing massively every year from that point, until we get to where we are today, with Valve's platform having over 50,000 games released on it, cementing it as the primary location to buy and download games on PC. As Steam grew, other companies took notice, with several major publishers launching their own digital distribution platforms. Electronic Arts brought us Origin, which is widely lambasted for being required even when buying one of their games through Steam. It isn't anywhere near as bad as it used to be though, being a borderline tolerable launcher these days, even if I can't think of a single thing that I've ever actually bought on it. Ubisoft released Uplay, or Ubisoft Connect as it seems to call itself now, similar to Origin, with the only notable difference that I can think of is that it refuses to remove my login details whenever I open it up, which is infrequently. The newest of the big publishers to get into the digital distribution game is Epic Games. While Epic have been around as a developer for decades, they entered the launcher market with a bang a few years ago, using it as the sole method of playing their insanely popular Fortnite on PC. As a store, it's light on features, famously taking several years to get a shopping cart added, making multiple purchases a headache. It's improving though, and when Epic finally get their shit together and add some much needed accessibility options, and improve their frankly appalling UI and UX design, it should be a reasonable alternative to Steam. As of right now, Steam has a roughly 75% market share in digital distribution of games on the PC. It was likely higher before Epic entered the market too, throwing huge sums of money at developers and publishers to acquire exclusive rights to games on their platform, a practice that left a lot of users with a bad taste in their mouths, but evidently didn't actually affect sales all that much. Valve's trip to the top of PC gaming hasn't been an entirely smooth one, however. In the 25 years or so since they came to be, they've been marred with several setbacks and controversies. In 2003, Valve's internal network was breached by a German hacker, Axel Gemb. The source code for the then unfinished Half-Life 2 was stolen and subsequently made its way onto the internet. Fans coming across it quickly compiled it and gained access to one of the most eagerly anticipated titles of the year, albeit unfinished. The following year, Gemb contacted Gabe Newell directly regarding the hack, under the impression that Valve wanted to hire him to work on their security. He was to fly to the US for an interview, with the FBI planning to arrest him on arrival at the airport. However, the German government got wind of the scheme beforehand and had him arrested in Germany before it could take place. In 2006, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation for the hack. Many of Valve's titles feature in-game cosmetic items, most notably Team Fortress 2 and CSGO. These cosmetics, usually taking the form of weapon skins or hats, can be bought, sold and traded over Steam via the inbuilt marketplace, with some of them selling for astronomical amounts. As CSGO rose in popularity within the esports scene, various sites started to appear offering players the chance to bet their skins, with the potential of winning something of much higher value. This was inherently against Valve's terms and conditions, however, and even if that wasn't the case, it was pretty sketchy regardless. Most notably, 2 YouTubers, T Martin and Pro Syndicate, got involved in the CSGO gambling scene, promoting a website that offered the service in sponsorship deals. Now, this isn't particularly unusual on YouTube, however it transpired that they owned the site and they were promoting it with the minimum disclosure of this fact. This all resulted in various lawsuits against Valve and involvement from the Federal Trade Commission. Ultimately, Valve demanded that all third-party sites using Steam functionality cease any gambling activity, with over 40 cease and desist letters being sent to the offending sites. For the vast majority of Steam's life, refunds weren't really a thing, Valve only offering them in the rarest of circumstances. In 2014, Valve was sued in Australia by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Courts found that Valve breached consumer law on various fronts, primarily because Valve claimed users weren't entitled to a refund under any circumstances and because they had omitted any kind of guarantee or warranty. Valve received a hefty fine of $3 million Australian, which they subsequently appealed against and lost. As a result of this, Valve implemented a refund policy in 2015, allowing a user to refund any game purchased directly through Steam, provided they had played it for less than 2 hours in a 14-day period since purchasing. This isn't anywhere close to being an exhaustive list of all the controversies and lawsuits that Valve have been involved in, but it does cover all the standout cases, impacted policy and the end user. Valve has always been known for being a company that pushes things forward in the game industry, generally not releasing a new game nowadays unless it can implement some kind of leap forward that progresses how we think about or interact with games. Half-Life had its unbroken narrative for maximum storytelling immersion, Half-Life 2 took physics implementation to the next level, and Portal made us rethink how first-person games can be played. VR was seen by many as that next logical step, and Valve was inclined to agree. Oculus VR, spearheaded by John Carmack, formerly of id Software and Doom fame, got to market first in March of 2016 with the Oculus Rift. A month later, Valve released its first VR headset, the HTC Vive, and Steam VR, offering up room-scale VR, allowing the player to somewhat freely move around the playspace rather than being confined in a single location. The Vive and the Rift were, on paper at least, pretty evenly matched, both having the same resolution and refresh rate, and generally left users with a positive experience. The ones that could stomach VR anyway. An updated model called the Vive Pro was released later, offering up a higher per-eye resolution, better head strap for increased user comfort, and better weight distribution, making it, at the time, the best headset on the market. It was, however, prohibitively expensive, coming in at a whopping $800 just for the headset alone, and $1,400 if you wanted everything else to go with it. All of this on top of the price of the powerful machine needed to run it as well. Valve broke away from their partnership with HTC in order to produce their new headset in-house. The Valve Index was announced in April of 2019 and released the following month. The specs of the headset are somewhat similar to the Vive Pro, with a combined resolution of 2880 by 1600, only now with a high refresh rate of up to 144Hz, and an effective field of view increase to 120 degrees. It was fully compatible with the base stations used for tracking by the Vive, meaning that owners of the previous headset could upgrade without having to completely replace everything. The main standout feature of the Index, however, was the improved motion sensing controllers. Previous controllers had buttons and limited hand sensing capabilities, as well as the traditional motion sensor. 87 sensors fully tracked finger position, height, motion and pressure to accurately display what a user's hand was doing in a game. It was genuinely impressive and a step forward for VR, blowing previous controllers out of the water. As amazing as Valve's foray into VR was shaping up to be though, they didn't have an IP releasing alongside to show them off, leaving it to other developers to make use of the hardware. However, in a shock late 2019 announcement, Valve showed off not only a new game built from the ground up for VR, but a new Half-Life game, 12 years after the previous one had released. Set 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2, Half-Life Alyx puts players in control of Alyx Vance, first introducing the sequel as they search for a weapon to help overthrow the Combine. Full-length games in VR were, and somewhat still are, a rarity, with most taking the form of shorter experiences or borderline tech demos. So to have a full-length, AAA VR game that was also a canonical Half-Life game was pretty amazing. It was a fantastic showcase of what was possible in VR, making full use of all the features the headsets on the market offered, while being fully compatible with the less capable headsets releasing earlier on. If you're on the fence about VR and have the opportunity to try Half-Life Alyx, regardless of whether you're a fan of the series or not, I encourage you to try this game. It's nothing short of phenomenal. Valve today is a relatively large company compared to when they first opened their doors in the 90s. Though with a few hundred staff members, this is still relatively small by AAA game development studio standards. A flat structure is in place, allowing developers at Valve to work on whatever they want, whenever they want, free to move departments at will. Gabe Newell is still the president, with a 50% stake of the company after Mike Harrington stepped down and moved on in 2000. They hold a dominant position in the PC gaming market, untouched for decades for better or worse. A monopoly isn't good for anyone other than those with that monopoly, with rivals such as Epic Games seeking to challenge that. They've made a move to being more of a hardware and software distribution focused company over the past few years. For a long time it looked like the Half-Life series was over, stuck in limbo waiting for a sequel that would never come. And it still hasn't technically, although Alyx gave a lot of people hope that Half-Life 3 may still happen one day. I guess we'll see. It'll no doubt require some step forward in gaming to be made in order to light a fire under the developers, like VR did. But if anybody can do it, I'd put my money on Valve. I initially started writing a small section about the Steam Deck now that it's released. At the time of writing, I still haven't got a chance to get mine yet. It's due sometime in the next 3 months. I'll no doubt do a follow-up when it arrives and I've had some time. Thank you for watching. If you managed to get this far into the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more content like this. Do you have a favourite Valve game? Did you grow up on Counter-Strike and Team Fortress Classic? Or have their games largely passed you by? Let me know down in the comments.